Hi there, and thank you for joining me for today's live reading of Larry Plumb Is Still Here by P.A. Kane, and this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1. As his eyes popped open at 3:41 a.m., Larry Plumb was filled with a momentary sense of dread. Though he hadn't smoked a cigarette in decades, he sometimes found himself tangled in a dream, hacking on a Marlboro Red just prior to waking, producing the first disappointing thought of the day. God damn it, I started smoking again. He moved his vigorous 56-year-old body to an upright position from the sofa bed where he slept by himself and quickly realized, as the fog of sleep lifted, that he'd been dreaming and hadn't started smoking again, which was a big relief. Rooted back in reality, he began prepping for the first task of the day, feeding the chickens. Already dressed in sweatpants and a clingy t-shirt, he flicked on the light, grabbed his yard hoodie, pulled it over his torso, and secured his bill's cap over his closely cropped, graying hair. Reality came further into focus when he fixed his thick-rimmed black glasses into place. The woman at the optical store said they looked great as she placed them over his symmetrical ears, but he was sure they made him look like an older, dorkier Buddy Holly. No, not Buddy Holly. Clark Kent, she said with a flirty smile, staring into his blue eyes. Exiting the room where he spent most of his inside hours, he noticed someone had placed a small metal placard emboldened with thick, austere letters that read, "Man Cave," on the frame above the door. He had received the placard as a Father's Day gift, but resisted displaying it, joking to his daughters not to pigeonhole him, that he might surprise them one day in a culotte and heels, which he could so rock. However, Larry was reluctant to accept what the trendy placard stood for because it didn't fit. His flat screen, books, laptop, and desk from which he managed his family's life didn't quite comport with present-day accepted man cave standards of neon beer logos, sports memorabilia, and banners. But what really disqualified the room was the soft, worn copy of Anne Sexton's The Complete Poems on his desk, and facing him, near the door frame, the 1949 print of Ella Fitzgerald at Downbeat Club singing before an enthralled Duke Ellington and Benny Goodman. These, among other artifacts, made the man cave designation null and void in Larry's mind. In the past, it might have annoyed Larry that his family and people, in general, had failed to consider this type of distinction. But his opinion about what a room was or wasn't, like most of his opinions, went unsaid. These days, with necks craned toward handheld devices, the whole world was absorbed in their own self-styled enclaves and had zero patience or need for his nuanced opinions, no matter how salient. The loudest and proudest carried the day. Larry also understood that all these bent-headed people were so over-patriarchal white men, even thoughtful, nuanced white men. Of course, there was strong pushback from the red-hatted grab 'em by the pussy crowd, but circumspect Larry was hardly a red hatter. Alienated from every partisan corner of society, he conducted the business of living with a quiet resignation, keeping his mouth largely shut and his opinions mostly to himself. He had set up the coffee the previous night. Though plagued by a burning semi-erection and a need to void his bladder, he sidestepped the bathroom, went into the kitchen, and hit the button on the coffee maker. With his mug anchored beneath the exit spout, he circled back to the bathroom. As he stood over the toilet watching the urine haltingly exit from his shrinking penis in dribs and drabs like an old leaky faucet, the day's second disappointing thought entered his mind, that perhaps he was past his prime. He quickly brushed the thought aside, deeming it self-indulgent to linger on these natural bodily changes, and checked the floor. Sometimes, little urine droplets ended up on the bathroom tile, and his wife Maureen pestered him about sitting down to pee. But Larry had been steadfast in his refusal to take a seat. He had been upright his whole life, and wasn't going to change over a few drops on the floor, no matter how much she nagged or flippantly hypothesized that he wouldn't comply because it would be emasculating for him to sit like a woman. He hated the cheap emasculation argument, but not as much as he hated that after being together for nearly 30 years, how little Maureen still knew about him or how his mind worked. Back in the kitchen, as the coffee staggered through its paces, he smoothly removed his mug from beneath the exit spout and put the tin cup pot back in place. The family cats, Betty and Frieden, met him in the kitchen and were wild with anticipation, rubbing up against him as he opened a can of turkey and gravy sauce to split between them. The Plum dogs, Donald and Lydia, named after the characters in the John Prine song, came with Larry's soft whistle from the living room, where they slept on opposing ottomans. Larry got down on one knee and greeted each golden retriever with warmth and affection. After sipping some coffee, he sprinkled a touch of whey into a water jug fitted with a stainless steel nipple and then filled a feed bucket near the back door. As he stepped out into the dark, frosty November morning, the dogs fanned out like sentries, sniffing and peeing along the fence perimeter of the double lot. The Plum house was a 4-bed, 2.5-bath bungalow built in 1920. It had good fundamentals that were enhanced by Larry's regular updates. In the decades Larry, Maureen, and the kids lived there, he renovated every room in the house. He also updated most of the electrical, windows, and water lines, and generally had a project going with one on deck. It was a safe, comfortable first-rung suburban home outside Buffalo, New York. This close to the city, it was odd to be raising egg hens. But animal-loving Maureen, after watching a million YouTube videos with the kids, was convinced they had enough space and tending to the chickens would require minimal work or commitment. Larry made a reasoned argument against the chickens, noting in a big picture kind of way the relatively short duration hens produced eggs and the hassle of feeding them and cleaning the coop. The inconvenience of clearing the snow in the winter, and the vigilance it would require to keep the dogs from killing them. After enlisting the kids to her side, Maureen prevailed. In short order, Maureen was also right about the work being minimal, since after the initial rush of obtaining the hens had faded, Larry did most of it. Larry named the 4 egg-producing hens: Dumbfuck, Stupid Shit, Lazy Ass, and Little Balls. They had trendy proper names, Kendall, Odin, Ellie, and Wynn, given to them by the girls, but Larry preferred to identify the chickens by their personalities. Dumbfuck and Stupid Shit, left to their own devices, would gladly walk into the jaws of the dogs and be torn to pieces. Lazy Ass was a classic underachiever, producing a single egg every 3 or 4 days. Little Balls was passive, always sitting back and waiting for her turn at the feeder instead of asserting herself like the other hens. Their oldest daughter, Samantha, was among those skeptical of Larry these days. Like many millennials and Gen Zers, she was consumed with the resistance and Me Too movements, and seemed to think of him and most white men his age as closed-minded, racist, and suffering from toxic masculinity. While Larry was certainly plagued with old codes, he appreciated the struggle of women and marginalized people for equity and worked to be both self-aware and non-toxic. But with Sam, there was little room for error. She policed his language and called out his middle-of-the-road views cruel and inhuman. At first, this kind of characterization hurt, but he recalled his own idealism at her age and wrote it off as that, thinking she would come around in time. But that time was still a way off. In line present-day conventions, she called Larry out for the offensive nicknames he gave the birds. You can't call a female bird that. What? Little Balls. It's anatomically incorrect. Sam, Larry said, hoping his daughter would catch the irony of her less than feminine name. It's meant to describe her personality, not her sex parts. She's passive. Those names are obnoxious. Would you rather I call her Sissy Pants or Little Pussy? Remember telling me how slurs of weakness almost always refer to women's genitalia? See how well I learned? How about you just call her by her real name? Wynn? She said indignantly and turned away from him. Piqued by the conversation, Larry was happy to be done with it too. Whether he was toxic, obnoxious, or whatever, the hens responded to him, especially Little Balls. Her underdog status quickly turned her into his favorite. Sometimes he would enter the coop, lock the other chickens in the henhouse, and feed her from his hand. She not only tolerated him picking her up, she loved it, cooing and gurgling with contentment as he stroked her feathers. As he changed out the water jug through a little door built into wire fencing, the birds rose with excitement. The top-loading feeders made it possible to avoid stepping into the coop, thus limiting the hens' exposure to the dogs. Another feature to keep the hens safe was a door atop the small house, making extracting the brown eggs easy. There was also a latched door on the side to clean out the pungent bedding and droppings that hit the senses like a well-placed sucker punch. Thankfully, with the colder weather, the bitter scent had dissipated. As he completed these tasks, aided by a headlamp and the stored energy of the little solar lights fixed around the perimeter of the coop, Little Balls waited for a go at the feeder like a well-mannered lady. Larry encouraged her. Come on, LB, get in there. Lazy ass doesn't do a damn thing with that fuel. Get in there. Beak that little malingerer. Despite a harsh gust of wind that ripped through Larry's hoodie and up into his nostrils, a smile rose to his lips as he thought about the absurdity of having a conversation with a chicken and promoting hen on hen violence. He could hear the soundbite in his head. Coming up, local man turns docile chicken into a killing machine. With the day's first couple of disappointments behind him, he laughed and thought about how he loved those shadowy blue mornings when the world was sleeping and he was awake. But he was more than just awake. He was alive. He felt strong and vital as he inhaled giant gulps of the early morning stillness. Out here in the blackness, he didn't have to endure the hassles of being ignored or argue his sensible points with challenged people. He was also thrilled to complete his morning tasks without hearing from all the whiners, complainers, and grievance-filled suburban white people he encountered all day long. Most of all, he loved that he was living while the rest of the world was sleeping. These black and blue mornings had always been special to Larry. It never took much for him to go to that place in his mind where he was a kid delivering the morning paper. He could feel the snow crunch under his feet when he read the stunning headline, Foreman knocks out Frazier in second round. Then, months later, being equally stunned when Muhammad Ali regained the heavyweight title after somehow knocking out Foreman. Or waking up in his college days, taking a nip of marijuana and reading a book like Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. Or talking up his sleepy son in the minivan on the way to 6 a.m. hockey practice. Or just sitting on the porch on a summer morning with a cup of coffee, listening to the nothingness as the moon slowly vacated the sky. With these first tasks completed, he moved into the roomy two-car garage, which served as the workshop, workout area, and sanctuary for Larry. Followed by the dogs, he placed the feed bucket next to some empty egg cartons on an old kitchen countertop, repurposed into a table. He slipped out of his yard boots, rolled out his mat on the interlocking rubber workout flooring, and the dogs watching went through a 20-minute yoga-based core routine that included crunches, planks, and knee kicks, among other exercises. Larry sometimes flirted with six-pack abs, but to get over that last hump, the beer and whiskey he drank most nights would have to be removed from his diet, which, to him, would have been like eliminating oxygen. Even in the most frigid parts of the western New York winters, when the day's I's had been dotted and the T's crossed, Larry would realign himself by listening to highly curated podcasts and music while he sipped whiskey and drank beer in the insulated garage. This life-affirming activity came about as the kids got older and needed less of his attention. Like everything in Larry's life, it was pursued with precision and discipline. He referred to his imbibing as an old football play, calling it a 42 dive. 4 beers, 2 whiskeys. That's all it took to perfectly restore his equilibrium. The prior night, after completing a lower body workout while sitting in his padded Adirondack chair on a little carpeted 10 by 10 platform, Larry plugged in Dan Carlin's current event podcast, Common Sense. With the Trump nonsense sucking up all the oxygen, he listened to Carlin talk about the possible opportunities and pitfalls, domestic and foreign, for the volatile president as he sipped his Rolling Rock / Jim Beam combo and replaced a power cord on the family's ancient Hoover vacuum. It was a solid analysis, devoid of fluff and partisanship, unlike the corporate media or, heaven forbid, the guys at work whose in-depth inquiry led them to conclude Hillary was a cunt and Trump was some pissed-off god with a comb-over. The podcast ended just as Larry had the vacuum cord locked in place. He poured his second beam, opened his third rock, and turned the lights down. He lit a few candles, opened the YouTube music app on his phone, hit the shuffle button, and sat back and listened. First up was Frank Turner's angry rant, Love, Ire, and Song. He liked the energy of this Turner kid, who seemed to channel the spirit of Billy Bragg. Like Bragg, he didn't try to hide his British accent and had crisply phrased, in-your-face lyrics. Absorbing the song, Larry wondered if he was one of the cowards Turner bitterly accused of despairing and selling out their ideals. Like with most questions, if dealt with honestly, there were all these gray areas and no easy answers. Injustice was everywhere, from the degradation of the planet to innocent kids being gunned down in schools. Larry attended to his civic duties with pride, kept his property in good standing, and filled his recycling tote to capacity each week. Though he hadn't been to Catholic church since grade school, he learned the lessons of the Sermon on the Mount and the Beatitudes as well. When people complained about taxes and programs to aid the most vulnerable among us, the Emma Lazarus quote, which he changed slightly and made his own, always popped into his head. None of us are free until all of us are free. After a few reflective moments, he decided, in thought and deed, with his wallet and his vote, that he was on the right side of history on all these issues. The side of doing something, the side of throwing shit against the wall like FDR in the early days of his presidency, rather than doing nothing or protecting some moneyed interest bent on plundering the earth and exploiting the weak and vulnerable. Further, he was cheered to think that, despite endless tragedies beyond his control, he cared for his own and still got after it every day. Though he didn't know where he fit in a rapidly changing world, he hadn't raised a white flag of surrender like some friends, coworkers, and maybe even Maureen. As easy as it would be to get all sloppy and cynical, he still popped up in the middle of the night and attacked each day with vigor, knowing instinctively that despite all its trying moments, life was still worth living, still worth pursuing. Fuck you, Frank Turner, he thought, laughing to himself. I'm still here. And a moment later, there was more evidence of Larry's continued engagement when the next tune-up was Bruce Springsteen's Thunder Road, which he hadn't heard in some time. Overall, the song didn't quite work for Larry. After the beautifully grounded introduction, it bounded off into this cowboy, take no prisoners, American kind of hubris. The characters scream into the night, free and unbridled, settling for nothing less than total victory. Larry knew everybody saw themselves in this scene, but it was fiction. People had to get up in the morning and go to work. It was nonsense to think you'd be feasting on the marrow of life with Mary at your side, screaming down some thunder road at 4 a.m. Maybe there was a night or two in your youth when you felt free and alive like this, but those days were long gone, crushed by the monotonous pounding of the day shift, which provided food, shelter, and Netflix. Absent this relentless, monotonous pounding, you'd be even more screwed, living in a box on the side of that fictional Thunder Road. And even if there were some transcendent wormhole of freedom, that's not what Larry wanted from life. What he wanted and needed was the infatuation and connection beautifully depicted in the song's intro. With a yearning, Larry was sucked right into the imagery of the slamming screen door, of Mary in a breezy dress, and the sound of Roy Orbison on the radio over that pleading harmonica and those tinkling piano keys. It struck Larry at the core of his being, making him feel vulnerable and desperate. And rather than running from these emotions or just sucking it up as he had been programmed to do all his life, he embraced the emptiness and was filled with a strange kind of melancholy that felt so good. The emptiness made him sigh and take a deep breath as tears welled in the corner of his eyes. But his reverie was soon interrupted when Maureen banged open the garage's man door, flicked on the lights, and began to yell above the music, "Larry, the dishwasher! The dishwasher isn't draining!" "Larry? Are you crying, Larry?"